fourth week doing this back to school sort of series. And this week we're going to be focusing on giving effective feedback. Deanna had asked a really important question about how we could make giving feedback a more efficient process so that we're not spending so much time. And I do promise we will get to that. So, Isaac, when you think about what good feedback looks like, what do you think?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I think one of the key pieces, and I know we're going to talk about this, is that it's got to be tied to criteria that both the person giving and getting the feedback have agreed to, because that solves a lot of possible problems, like it feeling like a personal attack or getting into traps of saying things like, that's beautiful, that's nice, you're so smart, which don't really have any impact on the learner or the learning, except possibly to limit the learning by thinking, oh, either I'm too smart to work on this, or they think I'm smart, I'm going to protect myself. But then from there, I do think it can come in many forms, from verbal feedback, video, notes written. But I think as long as we have that agreed upon criteria up front, and hopefully some exemplars to compare our own work to, then it's going to be meaningful to everyone.
So, like, when I think about really good, effective feedback, I think about a lot of the don'ts that you just also talked about. I always really try to avoid saying, like, starting feedback with I like or I love, or instead really focusing on like, if we're going to be giving positive feedback, what's being done well, like something validating that aligns with whatever the success criteria was or whatever goal the student was working on, and very clearly say, this piece of evidence worked really well with what you were trying to prove. I think that if you continue to add development on this piece of evidence, you got it. Because I think even positive feedback should still be instructive. And if they're doing something right and you want them to keep doing what they're doing and it's being done well, then you want to acknowledge that and say, in paragraph 3, you don't do as well of a job with a particular piece of evidence. But if you look back to this model that you have in paragraph 2, then I think you'll get it. So, always trying to stay, even when it's constructive, on the positive side, avoiding really negative sort of comments that are going to shut a learner down, like you were saying, Isaac. Like, we don't want to get them defensive. We want them to be able to hear what we're saying, and we certainly want them to be able to use it. That's what's most important. It doesn't mean anything if we spend 45 minutes writing all over essays or all over assignments and kids skip everything that we put on there. So even the constructive stuff, I think, really needs to acknowledge the challenge. It needs to talk about how they can improve, whether it's, using a particular strategy that was already taught in class, or if that one didn't work, providing examples and then giving another strategy that could also be effective.
I've seen so many of our partners have a lot of success with particular routines or protocols, and that's going from pre-K all the way through, advanced AP courses. But to use something like the Glow and Grow, where you give, it's kind of like a star and a wish, but something that I noticed from the criteria, like you said, that you've done well, and something I think you could work on, and adding that little step in between to tell something I realize that you've done according to the criteria, then to ask a question to clarify or to move the conversation forward, and then to give, TAG, give a suggestion or recommend a resource or something. And I think along the lines of what you're saying, that not only clarifies kind of the purpose of what we're doing, but it lets us all know what to expect. And having that consistency and that predictability lets me know, okay, I'm going to go into this. They're going to tell me something that I've done well. They're going to give me something to work on. So there's no surprise emotionally. And it's something we can reciprocate. Star's going to give me feedback. I'm going to give her feedback. We're all going to grow from it. And I think it really is huge, whatever type of resource or routine you use, but for everybody to be on the same page with it.
Right. And I think also when we think about what good feedback looks like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not only one way of doing it. So like when
Right.
we moved to G Suite like a million years ago when I was in the classroom, it was such an amazing sort of advance to be able to comment on things so that even if students resolved the comments that I put on there, I could go back in and unresolve them. Like all of them were saved. And they had that documentation of that ongoing conversation that was being had about their learning. Of course, when you're walking around the classroom with a clipboard, you're probably giving on the spot feedback all the time. So
Mm-hmm.
part of what we could do to hold kids accountable for that, and this kind of goes to Deanna's question a little bit too, is that kids have to be accountable and they need to write down the feedback they get when we're doing that walkthrough instead of it being our responsibility to maintain it for them. So if I stop by a group, they ask me a very targeted question, which is something we can also teach them to do. Make sure they're really good at advocating for asking for what they need instead of just saying things like, is this good? Is this good is not an acceptable way to ask for feedback. That is a very vague question that can mean almost anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to really teach kids to ask questions that really narrow our focus so that we could give them the best feedback we can in a short amount of time to get to as many kids as possible in that class period. I mean, if you have a 12th grade student like me and they're working on a 10-page paper and they say, is this good, with no focus, I'm not getting to more than 2 or 3 kids in that class period if I have to read an entire paper and give feedback to see if it's good.
Right.
I need to know what specifically they're working on, what specifically they want feedback on, and if there's a goal that they're working on and they tried something out and they want to know if it was useful or it worked, then it's really my job from that point on to first teach them how to zero in on what they want, and then for me to really be able to answer what they want. And I think that that's super important. It's almost as important as the quality of the feedback we're giving them, is really ensuring that, again, we keep our comments that could be vague as clear as possible and as specific as possible, highlighting both good and things that are constructive throughout a piece. And then, in terms of that efficiency piece, and I know, Isaac, that you've worked with young kids with this, but peer feedback is an essential part of this process as well.
Yeah.
We have to really train kids to first be really good identifiers of success criteria and what it looks like inside of an exemplar, so they know what they're looking for. And then we also really want to make sure that they know how to give those strategies. So if you're working with younger kids or even high school kids who are starting, they have maybe sentence starters for positive feedback, sentence starters for constructive feedback, and maybe a bank of strategies to create, to correct. And you could even spend a whole class period before a workshop just brainstorming, what are some things you could say to somebody who's struggling with this? What are some things, some pieces of advice that have worked for you?
Right.
Who said short and specific wins the day?
Yeah, that's from Matt. And I see Stacy Rappaport is on with us too.
Welcome, everybody.
Face to face.
So what do you have up here in this?
So what you were saying just really made me think about, how simple it can be, or like these ideas don't have to be complex. And often in kinder, first, even moving up through the grades, I will hear that when I'm in my own classroom before or now when I'm visiting or modeling a lesson. Did I do a good job? Is this good? Do you like it? And, especially with younger children, that gives me a quick pivot, which is to say, of course it's good, or of course I like it. You're working on it. Tell me about it. And then to say, okay, hey, let's look at our rubric, or let's look at the example, or let's check our checklist and see. And here on the screen, you see just a very simple one. This was actually developed by some of my friends in Staten Island, right next door to Stacy, but at PS68, this version came from. But then we can say, well, if we know the child before, hey, I know you're really working on telling those events in order. Let's check and see if you did that. Or, let's ask your partner. But yeah, anytime we can bring it right back to those criteria, again, that's good. And I was trying to pull up on the side, but I was a little slow on the draw, that even with very young children who will, of course, need an icon because they'll be able to remember the words of the icon, but they won't be able to decode those yet necessarily, to have something like a Glow and Grow that has the sentence frames just like we have for 2nd through 12th graders, but with their little picture that reminds them what they're saying, so they can tell, I looked at the rubric and I noticed you blank. I looked at the rubric and I wonder if you, and there's nothing cuter than watching 2 5-year-olds talk about the story they've drawn and labeled, or how they've read together, or the math problem they've solved. And there's nothing more powerful than showing a video of that to your older students and saying, well, your work is much more complex, but the ability to give feedback is the same. If you're clear on the expectations and what it looks like in practice,
right,
then you can do this just as well as I can. Kind of. You're still the expert in the room, but but that's such a great point. If we don't know what they need, we can help them, but it's going to take too long, and we're going to burn ourselves out, and then they may not use it because it's all from us. It's not that partnership.
So, like, even having said that, thinking about those peer partnerships, one thing that I do in my 9 to 12 classes, whether it's journalism or it was my ELA classes, and I actually got the idea from my journalism classroom, my newspaper classroom, where everything is sort of broken up by section already. Those are my expert groups. And I had student editors for each one of those groups. And then we had an apprenticeship situation set up where we had our junior editors learning from our senior editors, and the reporters who were on the paper then reported to the students, not to me, because each one of those editors knew specifically what criteria made a good news article. They knew what to look for in the lead. They knew what to look for in the organization to ensure that readers got what they needed right away. They knew how to attribute appropriately for that kind of writing. Same with my feature editors and same with my opinion editors. So from that experience, I had created peer feedback in the classroom, that book that I wrote for ASTD, where you create expert groups even in a regular English classroom for writing workshop, where you have some students trained on giving feedback on introductory paragraphs, the specific things they're going to be looking for in terms of developing a clear thesis statement or a claim or whatever you're calling it these days, developing context so that you're bringing the reader in and you're keeping them engaged and building a framework for what they could see throughout the essay. Then there was an organization group, a cohesion group, an evidence group, and a conclusion group. And each one of those little groups were trained specifically to identify common problems that were happening in whatever area they were working on. And they developed a bank of both positive feedback when things were working and some constructive feedback with strategies. And that kind of took a lot off of my plate, because before students could come to me, they had to go to the experts in the room. So that's one way, Deanna, if you're listening, that we could really offset some of that feedback. The other ways that I'm thinking also really streamlined it for me was I wasn't just doing written feedback on their actual work. I was using Voxer sometimes in the mornings while I was stuck in my car before I went inside. I'd open their work up on my laptop, and then on my phone with Voxer, I would shoot them a box and I would say, like, I'm looking at paragraph 2 right now. I see, like, so sometimes when constructive feedback needs to be given and I want them to hear my voice so that they could hear that it's coming from a kind place, and that there are other strengths there and they don't get bogged down in how much I kind of wrote on their papers, I like to give verbal feedback. You could also give video feedback with apps like Flipgrid. That's a great way to give feedback to kids. Or their one-on-one conference or small group conference is always a great way to do it as well, especially with the kids who do need a little bit more instructive sort of help because they may have missed the mark. And then teaching them to track their feedback by taking the feedback they got in a notebook or on a document, saying, this is what I'm struggling with. This is the feedback that I got. This is how I'm going to apply it to my work. And then afterwards, before they reflect again, when they submit that summative finished work, they could say, this is what I did. These were my steps. I tried using this strategy. I think it worked in this paragraph. I'm still struggling somewhere else. And I'm sure all of us as teachers would love kids to be able to articulate on that level of being able to identify where they know they are successful and where they are still struggling.
One thing I heard in that too is it's kind of like the strategy we hear a lot, ask 3 before me, but you're really setting them up for success. So it's because sometimes I think to students that sounds almost like you're blowing them off, or that we value our time more than we do each of them. But you set them up to really know what that means. And just to be clear, I'm not saying anybody who's using 3 before me is doing that. But when I put myself in the student's shoes, I could see how I could feel that way. But now you said this is exactly how we can do it. And then Matt, as you can see, is kind of sharing about the performing music classes. So I wonder if you had a comment on that.
So I mean, I was just writing him back in here.
Oh, good.
This idea that we teach kids to diagnose first, and being able to then that's really 3/4 of the issue for them to know what they're doing well. And that success criteria that you showed for young kids, Isaac, stuff like that, like the single point rubric.
Yes.
It's a great way for kids to then go through. And if this is, or whichever rubric we're using, if these are the standards that we're working on, this was the agreed upon success criteria, before they come to us, they should do a self-assessment. All right, I have this piece of evidence that lines up with this. So they should be able to, at that point, look at the rubric, identify pieces of their own work that support whether or not they've gotten it. And if they're still missing stuff, that's when they can ask. I have gone back through, I've noticed that I'm doing this all right, but I'm still really struggling with analyzing my quote instead of just summarizing it, and that's something that, takes a lot of time. I know that middle school teachers are teaching students that, but I know that by the time they got to me in 12th grade, they were still doing it. It's a hard habit to break, because sometimes if kids are like I was when I was that age, sometimes I found really good quotes before I even knew what I wanted to say. And I found a way to work in, I made my argument around the quotes that I found and not the other way around. So it became this puzzle that I was putting together, instead of having a really clear argument I was trying to prove, and then finding the appropriate evidence to support what I was trying to prove. And it wasn't until college, I think, that I really started to understand that, you have to have your own clear ideas before you start finding the evidence to support them, and not the other way around. But there is certainly a real, it's a real easy thing to fall into when you're first learning how to do analysis in a paper, and when you're trying to give feedback to somebody and you say, this is summary and not analysis. At that point, most teachers will want to have full lessons about what the difference between those two things are, and how you can add value to what you're trying to say about why that quote is sitting on the page, and how it supports whatever claim you're trying to make, instead of just having something from the text that you're calling evidence that doesn't actually support anything that you're trying to say. Yeah, I love, it was that Stacy who said that they start early with using hand signals in the room. I love that. And I think for young kids, that's a great way to do it. I don't know that I would be able to get my 12th graders to do it. But because at that point, I think that they embarrass a lot easier when they're
Right.
not. So I think just the whole idea of having those small groups and building that community where you could receive constructive feedback and know that the whole point of it is to make whatever you're doing better, whether it's solving a math problem, going through the scientific method and you're writing a lab, or any piece of writing that you're doing for any class, or regular essays for English class, research papers.
Mm-hmm.
You just took the my quick take on single point rubrics. I love I love Jen.
Yeah. She's a hero, and it's funny. This is one of the articles I've shared more than just about any other article, and there's a podcast related to this one, but the quick image has cleared up things for so many people, and it's amazing when the kids give their teacher feedback on like, oh, this makes so much more sense now.
Mm-hmm.
And she's so clear about it.
Um,
Linda White Keeling is sharing about the hand signals in high school.
yeah, I was wondering how they respond.
Yeah.
Fist to 5 for
that's one of my favorites,
Yeah, in a group, I mean, in terms of whether or not they're getting something and
Right.
whether we need to slow down or speed up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as a group, I think that makes good sense to do stuff like that. When you're talking about their individual performance on something, that might take a little bit more. One of the articles that I shared in our document calendar was about ways you could develop Google Forms to also make giving feedback a little bit more efficient. So like when we're giving when group presentations are happening, for example, I know one of the things I always struggled with is how do you ensure that the students in class pay attention to those presentations, make the learning meaningful for the presenter and also for the listener. And part of what I started to do was create these Google Forms that after each group, students were responsible for filling out the form about what their takeaways were, what they learned, and then feedback for the group so that I would get it off the form and then I would send it out to the group after with my feedback put in there as well. Because obviously if we're doing group presentations, we're not going to be grading the whole group and giving everybody the grade in the group. We're going to be providing feedback, and then they're going to be doing some other assignment where they're applying the knowledge that they learned by doing the group work so that you could truly assess each student and where they are on the progression at that point.
Something I hear kind of underlying in every example you share too is that idea that like in that cycle of feedback, there's always that moment for revision. Usually they're working on, and I'm going to share the article you have, I know about the giving the feedback on writing, but that they have that opportunity to use the feedback then so they can learn from it and check, because if they use the feedback and don't fix it, then we know that there was a disconnect somewhere.
Right.
And I love what you just said too about how that project builds the capacity they need to now transfer that learning into a new way and really make sure it's solidified.
That was actually one of the things that I first started doing when I started going gradeless after I read Ken O'Connor's book. One of the things he comments on is about group projects and the way that we grade them. And I was certainly guilty of it, just like everybody else is when they start. When you see a product, you assess the product, and then you just assign that grade to everybody who is in the group. But we all know that there is generally not 100% equity in a good deal of groups. I'm not saying it doesn't happen on that rare occasion, but there is usually an imbalance of where the learning is coming from in those spaces that sometimes makes it hard to identify. So, I mean, the first thing that we kind of put in there was doing reflections, even about the group work, so that they could talk about their contribution, what they learned, what they still need to work on, and then having that next assignment where whatever that skill set was around the text we were reading or anything else, they had an opportunity to do an independent piece of writing or project that then showed what they learned from doing that group work, and also showed their depth of understanding of whatever content we were working on at that time. And then there was a reflection that went with that as well. So they were essentially giving me feedback about the learning experience before I did that final assessment, so that I could read and provide feedback through the lens of their reflection. So if they had given me, like, I've been working on A and B, these were the strategies you told me to do. If you look at this portion of my paper, you could see that I employed them. Then I know that when I'm looking at that assignment, I could give really targeted, personalized, differentiated feedback based on each individual student after I read their reflection and then go through their assignment. So that's another tip for everybody. If you're having your students do reflections, read them first and then form your lens based on what they tell you, especially if they didn't do the assignment correctly. That reflection should notify you ahead of time what they thought they were supposed to be doing. And then you could norm the feedback that you're giving around that instead of what the assignment was asking.
That's so powerful. I remember this was years ago now, but when Paul Bloomberg was in one of my schools at the time, and this just happened in the moment. He wasn't a big deal to him, but when he walked up to one of our, I think like fourth graders, he said, "Okay, what do you want feedback on?" And I was like, "Oh yeah." We had these big conversations trying to get to that, but that was so simple. And the kid who, we were really digging into feedback, but it was still early in that journey for us, with some great people at Bruce Drysdale Elementary who did great work there. But the kid right away was able, just think for a second to a total stranger who had just walked up and say, "Well, I'm really trying to figure out how to do this." Got great feedback, and moved on. And so I love the way you said, let's make sure that's a process in place so that every kid gets that opportunity. They learn what they need to learn, and we focus on what they need. And I know that question started from the point of how do we do this without getting bogged down and overwhelmed. And if you can tell me what to focus on in your 6-page paper, and I've got 170 of them, I'm going to focus on that.
And that's the thing too with reflections and the feedback that we give at the end of the process. If we've done a really good job giving feedback throughout the formative process, by the time we get that summative piece at the end, the final draft, we really shouldn't be giving too much more feedback unless, like we're either setting kids up to start a new round of goal setting because they've met the goals that they set for this particular assignment, or they're really missing the mark. And it's important that we acknowledge the things they got right, and we also redirect them when they are still missing the mark. And if you notice that students are doing that, that's when you really make sure that you have that one-on-one conference time. Maybe not even during class. Maybe you set up office hours and you ask the student to come in when it's less pressure and you're not focusing on the whole room, but you could really give your full attention to that student and the needs of that particular student.
Especially now that we're in the virtual world, whether you are right now, you will be if you're not now at some point. But that takes so much of that pressure. And as you said, when we hit all of us somewhere in between 11 and 18, we peak at feeling that the world is watching us and judging our every move and thought. And so how powerful to be able to get that, not on the side, but in a place where you feel more comfortable in a small group or on your own. And Matt really made this connection to what you're saying with like how powerful that is to build a relationship. When I'm giving you feedback on what you're working on, not what you produced. And it reminds me of Alan Daly's quote from years ago at the first Minefield was he said, we need to see each other as human beings, not human doings. And how powerful is it to acknowledge that in each of us?
And I think, as we're wrapping up now, Isaac, I see that you already provided a lot of the examples from the text, but the Core Collaborative does have an excellent YouTube channel with a lot of examples of feedback and self-assessment in a variety of different content areas. So if you are a social studies teacher, a math teacher, a science teacher, we do have a lot of examples, every grade from elementary and kinder straight up through high school. On my YouTube channel, I also have a lot of examples. Some of the ones that Isaac posted are screencasts of me giving feedback from specific, reflections and other things. And thank you for linking the calendar. So I think next week's topic is teaching students to track their progress, which we kind of gave a little bit of a
separate it all out.
So I think next week, if that's something you're really interested, or you have a tracking document that you want to share, please put it on the document for everybody to use it. And if you continue to have questions in this way, obviously in 30 minutes, we're not going to be able to solve all the feedback problems in the world, but we could certainly start to think about what are we doing already, what is effective for our students, and how can we be better for them. So thanks again, Isaac, for another great week. And I think the live YouTube worked this time.
Yeah.
Email. So I think that's really good. So if you wanted to share these little help sessions with your friends, we are also broadcasting live on YouTube now. So,
and I forgot to check, but I just did, and it has been going live.
Awesome.
Didn't have a sticky note for us, so it didn't happen. You know me, I got to have my little reminder.
Well, thank you all for coming. I hope your school years, if they've started already, are going well. And for those of you who haven't started yet, I can't wait to keep going. Really excited. Who just said love next week's topic? I'm so glad.
Matt, and I'm positive he'll be coming with more ideas and examples as he does every time. We appreciate that. I'm so glad to have you all on.
All right, everybody, have a great day. We really